August 1940. The sun had barely climbed over the rolling hills of rural England, but the air already carried a tension heavier than any morning fog. Birds hesitated in their songs, and the usual hum of farm life seemed muted, as if the land itself was holding its breath. In the middle of a modest field, surrounded by neat rows of wheat and the distant outline of hedgerows, Thomas Hargrove worked alone, his hands rough from decades of tending soil, yet nimble from a lifetime of tinkering with gears, levers, and strange contraptions no one else seemed to understand. Thomas was, in the eyes of his neighbors, a man touched by eccentricity, perhaps even a little crazy. He had a reputation for odd inventions, a wind-powered hay baler that whirred and clanged like a metal beast, a self-watering system that sometimes flooded the garden, and, more recently, a curious device that made a low, whining hum whenever he adjusted its dials. "That Hargrove?" they'd whisper in the village market. "He's forever chasing shadows and dreaming of impossible things." But Thomas had always known that usefulness often wore the guise of madness, and today he had a feeling that usefulness would be demanded of him in a way he had never imagined. Rumors had begun filtering into the countryside, sparse, almost unbelievable reports from RAF pilots and local farmers alike. Luftwaffe bombers had been sighted over nearby towns, and everyone feared they might soon descend upon their quiet fields. Children were instructed to stay close to home. Farmhands worked with uneasy glances toward the sky, and in the pubs men spoke in hushed tones about destruction raining down from the clouds. For most, it was distant, abstract danger, but for Thomas, every shadow passing across his fields felt like a warning dot as he wiped the sweat from his brow and adjusted the strange device he had been working on through the night. He noticed it, a fleeting, almost imperceptible shimmer in the sky. At first, he thought it might be a trick of sunlight, but then he saw it again, a formation of aircraft moving silently, methodical, deliberate. His heart thudded, not with fear, but with recognition. Something was coming, and it was coming closer than anyone else realized. Thomas's mind raced. He thought of his wife, Margaret, kneeling in the garden gathering herbs, of his 2 young children playing under the hedgerows, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering above them. He thought of the village, its church spire, its cobblestone streets, its sleepy homes. All of it, fragile and exposed, dangling under the wings of machines designed to destroy. And he knew, with an unsettling clarity, that the world outside these fields was changing, shifting into a danger that no plow or pitchfork could fend off. Yet, amid the fear, there was a spark of determination. If anyone could confront the looming threat, Thomas thought, it would be someone who understood machines, who could see patterns where others saw only chaos. And he had his inventions, odd and unwieldy though they might be. Perhaps today, the village's survival would hinge not on soldiers or bombs, but on the ingenuity of a man the world had quietly labeled a fool. He tightened a bolt on his contraption and stepped back, squinting toward the horizon. The wind carried the faint roar of engines, a sound that made the hairs on his arms rise. The planes were closer now, their shadows stretching across the fields, moving like predators circling their prey. Thomas felt a chill, but also a resolute fire inside him. This was no ordinary day, no ordinary test, and deep down, he knew that the next few hours would determine the fate of everyone he loved. For a moment, he allowed himself a small, grim smile. Let them come. If they wanted to rain destruction upon his home, they would first have to contend with a farmer who the world had written off as crazy, and maybe, just maybe, that madness was the village's only chance. And with that thought, Thomas Hargrove turned his gaze fully skyward, the horizon alive with the ominous silhouettes of aircraft, and began to prepare for a day that would test every ounce of his courage, ingenuity, and resolve. The day after Thomas first spotted the distant silhouettes of Luftwaffe planes, the village was alive with a quiet, uneasy murmur. At the market, men exchanged news with the kind of tension that comes from knowing something dreadful is approaching but not yet seeing it with their own eyes. Pilots from nearby airstrips stopped by, their uniforms dusty from long flights, faces lined with fatigue and fear. They spoke of formations of German bombers, Low-level reconnaissance sweeps over the countryside and towns left in smoldering ruin. Each story Thomas heard made his stomach tighten, but also sharpened his mind. There was a pattern here, he sensed, a rhythm to their movements, a method to the madness. Thomas tried to warn the villagers. In the bakery, he leaned over the counter as Mrs. Ellsworth kneaded dough, her hands coated in flour. "They're coming closer," he said, voice low but insistent. "The planes. You need to be ready." She shook her head, giving a tight, nervous smile. "Now, Thomas, don't go scaring people again. You've been at this since last week, and nothing's happened." Her words stung, not because she dismissed him outright, but because they reflected the skepticism that followed him everywhere he went. It was always like this. Farmers chuckled at his odd contraptions, children called him the mad tinkerer, and even the RAF pilots who stopped to chat often smiled indulgently at his theories. Thomas had learned to take it in stride. If anyone believed in preparation when others doubted, it would be him. He had long since realized that being labeled eccentric was far preferable to being unprepared. When danger arrived, by late afternoon, he found himself back in the fields, scanning the sky with a pair of binoculars, trying to decipher the enemy's approach. From a distance, he could see the glint of aircraft wings against the sun, tiny specks at first, but steadily growing larger as they drew closer. He jotted notes in a small, worn notebook, times, directions, altitudes, even the faint trails of exhaust smoke. With each observation, a clearer pattern emerged. The Germans weren't attacking randomly, they were relying on predictable flight paths and timing their raids to avoid anti-aircraft defenses wherever possible. It was a methodical, almost mechanical approach, and Thomas, who had spent decades tinkering with machines and analyzing their behavior, understood that predictability was a weakness. Back in his workshop, a small lean-to cluttered with tools, scraps of metal and half-finished inventions. He began sketching diagrams and adjusting gears on an odd-looking device. The gears clicked under his touch, the cogs spinning in precise harmony. He imagined it in the sky, between the planes, disrupting their rhythm. Something about it felt right. Thomas knew he had to exploit what he had learned. The Luftwaffe's reliance on reconnaissance was a vulnerability, one that could be turned to his advantage, even as he worked. The villagers continued their routines, blissfully unaware of the looming threat. Children ran between hedgerows, cows grazed lazily in the pastures, and smoke curled from chimneys as the baker pulled fresh loaves from the oven. Life went on, fragile and ordinary, while danger crept closer with every passing hour. Thomas's heart ached for them. He thought of Margaret, who had begun preparing the household in subtle ways, storing supplies and checking the barn for structural weaknesses, and his children, blissfully playing as though the war were a distant story told by grown-ups at night. The contrast between the normalcy of life and the horror he anticipated made his resolve even stronger. By evening, Thomas climbed a small ridge overlooking the village, binoculars in hand, and watched the sky. The planes had returned, this time lower and more numerous. He traced their approach, noting small deviations in their flight paths, slight hesitations in their movement, a momentary pause here, a dip there. Patterns emerged, and with them the seed of a plan. If he could predict where they would go, if he could disrupt their timing even slightly, the consequences could be enormous, but so could the risk. One miscalculation, one missed detail, and the entire village could be lost. Thomas allowed himself a brief, grim smile. He had always loved puzzles, machines, and the satisfaction of making something work against the odds. Now, the stakes were higher than ever, and the puzzle was more dangerous. His mind raced with possibilities, calculating angles, timing, and potential outcomes. It was a dangerous game, but one he felt uniquely equipped to play. As night fell, Thomas returned to his workshop, the cool evening air brushing against his face. Lantern light cast long shadows across his sketches and tools, highlighting diagrams of cogs, pulleys, and the beginnings of a mechanical device that might just turn the tide. Outside, the wind whispered through the wheat fields, carrying with it the faint roar of engines in the distance. The Luftwaffe was coming, and Thomas's plan strange, improbable, and utterly untested, was the only thing standing between the enemy and his home. He paused for a moment, listening. Somewhere in the distant sky, the planes moved, almost imperceptibly, like predators circling the edge of a forest. His pulse quickened. One wrong move, one misstep, and disaster would rain down on the village. But for the first time in days, Thomas felt a flicker of hope. The enemy's predictability was his advantage, and his ingenuity, once dismissed as folly, might be the one thing that saved them all. Thomas Hargrove worked late into the night, the soft glow of a lantern illuminating his cluttered workshop, casting shadows that danced across the walls like restless spirits. The air smelled of oil, metal, and burned wood, a familiar mixture that always accompanied his experiments. He adjusted a lever, tightened a bolt, and whispered to himself, "Come on, come on. Work the way I need you to." Before him lay a contraption unlike anything the villagers had ever seen, a haphazard assembly of wires. Pulleys, mirrors, and rotating blades, designed to emit flashes of light and bursts of smoke at precise intervals. To any passerby, it would look like nonsense. To Thomas, it was the key to survival. The idea had come to him in fragments over the past days, pieced together from observations of the Luftwaffe's reconnaissance patterns. Their planes moved with meticulous precision, relying on timing, visibility, and predictable flight paths. If he could disrupt their sense of orientation, even for a moment, it might be enough to force them off course, to prevent bombs from finding the village. But the device was far from perfected. His first test ended in disaster. A pulley snapped, sending a small gear flying across the floor, and smoke curled from a misaligned mirror. Thomas cursed it under his breath, wiping soot from his hands. "Not good enough," he muttered. He knew that failure wasn't an option, not now. With steady hands, he scavenged materials from old farm machinery, scavenged wires from a broken radio, and melted scraps of tin into new components. Each piece had to be precise, every timing exact. A fraction of a second's error could mean destruction. The next morning, Thomas ventured into the village, carrying his device under a tarp. At the market, children pointed and laughed, whispering to their parents about the mad tinkerer's latest contraption. Mr. Ellsworth, the baker, shook his head as Thomas passed. "Still at it, eh? Don't you think we've had enough excitement already?" he said with a chuckle. The words stung, but Thomas offered only a polite nod. Skepticism had always been part of his life, and he had learned to let it roll off his back. What mattered was the outcome, not the opinions of those too comfortable to see danger approaching. Back at the farm, he set up the device in a small clearing near the edge of the field, choosing a vantage point that gave him an unobstructed view of the sky. Each component had to be calibrated perfectly. Mirrors angled to catch the sun and moon, gears timed to release flashes of light, smoke dispensers rigged to respond at precise intervals. Thomas tested each function individually, noting minor imperfections, making adjustments with painstaking care. Hours stretched into a day, and he barely stopped to eat. His focus absolute. As evening approached, he ran a full test under the dim light of dusk. The device sprang to life, spinning and whirring. Flashes of light reflecting off mirrors, smoke curling into the cooling air. For a moment it seemed to falter. A pulley slipped, the timing of the flashes was slightly off, and a puff of smoke blew in the wrong direction. Thomas's heart raced as he adjusted the mechanism, sweat dripping down his forehead. This was the moment when failure felt most dangerous, not because anyone could see it, but because the consequence of imperfection could be catastrophic. Despite the challenges, Thomas persisted. He improvised with parts from his barn, experimented with different configurations, and even rigged a small wind-powered rotor to ensure the device could function autonomously once triggered. With each iteration it grew more reliable, more precise, until at last, as the moon rose high above the field, Thomas stepped back and surveyed his creation. It was crude, certainly, and by any conventional measure. Utterly bizarre, but it was ready, even now. He could hear the faint hum of engines in the distance, the prelude to the approaching Luftwaffe planes. He knew the villagers would still dismiss it as nonsense. A foolish invention made by a man they had long labeled crazy. Margaret had tried to hide her concern, but he could see it in her eyes, worry, fear. and a quiet hope that her husband might succeed against the odds. Thomas felt a surge of resolve. The device might fail, yes, but it was the only chance they had. He had tested, adjusted, and refined it with every ounce of knowledge and intuition he possessed. By the time the first stars dotted the sky, Thomas had completed his final adjustments. He stood back, breathing heavily, muscles aching, eyes fixed on the horizon where the planes would soon appear. Every detail had been accounted for, timing, positioning, even the subtle shifts in wind direction. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The lives of his family, his neighbors, and his village hung in the balance. Yet beneath the weight was a quiet thrill, the adrenaline of possibility, the edge of genius against desperation. He glanced toward the village, lights flickering in windows as families prepared for the night, oblivious to the danger circling above. For Thomas, the next few hours would decide everything. The device was set, the plan was ready, but whether it would succeed or fail remained a question suspended in the dark sky, waiting to be answered by the coming storm. The first hint of movement came as a faint droning in the distance, barely audible over the whisper of wind through the wheat. Thomas Hargrove froze, heart hammering in his chest, his eyes scanning the darkened sky. The silhouettes had returned, larger this time, more menacing, as the shadows of Luftwaffe bombers cut through the faint light of early dawn. The village below remained quiet, the streets empty, unaware of the approaching storm. Every instinct in Thomas's body screamed urgency. This was it, the moment his months of observation, planning, and invention would be tested against the cruel precision of war. He moved quickly to his contraption, a bizarre assembly of mirrors, pulleys, and smoke dispensers, standing alone in the field like a mechanical sentinel. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the timing, checking each gear and lever with meticulous care. One false move now, one misalignment, and the consequences could be catastrophic. He glanced at his small notebook, reviewing the sequence of flashes and bursts, memorized in painstaking detail. The Luftwaffe pilots would have mere seconds to react, and Thomas's device had to work flawlessly, or the village would pay the price. The droning grew louder, engines cutting sharply through the stillness of the morning. Thomas could make out the faint glint of metal against the horizon as the bombers descended, their formations precise and methodical. He took a deep breath and activated the device. The first flashes of light arced across the field, mirrors catching the early sun in brief, dazzling bursts. Smoke curled upward in deliberate puffs, timed to create confusion. For a heartbeat, nothing seemed to happen. Then one plane veered slightly, its formation wobbling as the sunlight reflected directly into the cockpit. Thomas's pulse quickened. He adjusted a dial, sending another burst of light and smoke into the air. A second plane shifted, its path altered ever so slightly, but the tension was unbearable. One plane remained on course, flying low and steady, and Thomas realized a small pulley had slipped in the device, delaying the timing of one of the flashes. His stomach tightened as he raced to make a quick adjustment, sweat dripping into his eyes. Each second felt like an eternity, the roar of engines a constant reminder of the destruction that waited if he failed. From the ridge above the village, Thomas could see faint silhouettes of villagers beginning to stir, unaware of the danger overhead. A group of children ran toward the morning market, their laughter carrying lightly across the fields. Margaret stood at the doorway of their cottage, hands clenched together, eyes wide with worry. The thought of them, so fragile, so innocent, spurred Thomas onward. Every movement, every adjustment of the machine was now tied to the lives of everyone he loved. The bombers drew closer, and the first shadows passed over the fields, stretching long and menacing across the golden wheat. Thomas's contraption emitted a sharp click as one of the gears shifted into place, sending another blinding flash skyward. Smoke puffs burst in rapid succession, curling in irregular patterns designed to obscure the village below. He could see the effect immediately. The formation wavered. Engines roared as one pilot struggled to adjust, veering slightly off the intended path. Another plane followed, and Thomas felt a surge of cautious hope, yet the danger was far from over. A sudden gust of wind tilted one of the mirrors, misaligning the light burst. The timing was off by mere seconds, and Thomas felt a pang of panic. He leapt forward, twisting the mirror back into position just as a bomber's shadow passed directly over the clearing. The sound of engines and the faint rattling of bomb doors made his stomach churn. Every moment counted, and any miscalculation could mean devastation. Through the mist of smoke and light, Thomas watched the planes falter. The flashes confused their targeting instruments, and the smoke obscured landmarks that pilots relied on to aim. One bomber dropped slightly too early, another veered sharply to avoid what the eye could only perceive as phantom obstacles. Thomas held his breath, a mixture of fear and hope, as the devices continued their precise, chaotic dance across the field. For a tense moment, it seemed as though the enemy would push through, unaffected by the contraption's desperate intervention. Engines roared directly overhead, the vibrations shaking the ground beneath Thomas's feet. He clenched his fist, teeth grinding, eyes fixed on the formation. The village below remained blissfully unaware, yet the weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force. If he failed now, every house, every life, every familiar face could be lost in an instant. Then a slight ripple ran through the formation, the first real sign that the plan was working. Pilots adjusted their flight paths, hesitated, wavered. Thomas's chest tightened as he realized the device was causing confusion, creating just enough chaos to interfere with the bombing run. But he knew better than to relax. The planes were still overhead, engines droning, shadows stretching across the village. One final moment of uncertainty remained. Could his invention hold against the precision and experience of trained Luftwaffe pilots? The answer hovered in the early morning sky, unresolved, leaving Thomas and the audience suspended on the knife edge of suspense, waiting for the outcome that would determine the fate of everyone he loved. Thomas Hargrove's heart pounded as the first real signs of his invention's success appeared. From his vantage point in the field, the chaos he had engineered unfolded like a carefully choreographed ballet of light, smoke, and mechanical precision. Mirrors caught the rising sun, sending dazzling flashes across the approaching Luftwaffe formation, while puffs of smoke, timed the second, obscured landmarks the pilots relied upon. The planes wavered, engines roaring in frustrated adjustments. One bomber dipped sharply, narrowly avoiding the smoke plume that twisted unnaturally in the wind, while another released its payload far too early, bombs plummeting into an empty meadow rather than the village below. Thomas could scarcely believe what he was seeing. Each flash, each puff of smoke, acted like a finger poking the pilot's confidence, unraveling their precision and forcing hesitation at critical moments. His contraption, assembled from scraps, gears, and mirrors, had become an invisible shield for the village. The shadows of the bombers stretched across the fields, twisting and faltering in a way that no one could have anticipated. It was as if the machines themselves were being manipulated by some unseen force, and the pilot's carefully calculated movements descended into frantic improvisation from the ridge above the village. Thomas spotted faint figures emerging into the morning light, neighbors drawn by the distant roar of engines. Their expressions froze, mouths open in disbelief. As they witnessed the drama unfolding in the skies above their homes, Mr. Ellsworth, the baker, staggered back against a fence, clutching his hat. "By God," he muttered, voice trembling. Even the local RAF patrol, stationed on a nearby hill and watching from binoculars, paused mid-report, astonished at the sudden deviation of enemy planes. Thomas's crazy contraption was working, and the evidence was undeniable. Yet the moment was far from one of complete relief. A low-flying bomber, one of the fastest and most experienced in the formation, swooped dangerously close to the village edge. Thomas's pulse quickened. He adjusted the mirrors, sending a series of sudden, blinding flashes directly into its cockpit. The pilot's hands wavered on the controls. The plane lurched, clipped a distant tree line, and veered sharply off course. Relief surged through Thomas, but it was tempered by the gnawing knowledge that the danger was still real. One miscalculation, one delayed reaction, and disaster could have struck. Smoke spiraled skyward from Thomas's device, curling and twisting in erratic patterns that created the illusion of phantom obstacles. The remaining bombers, confused and disoriented, began to abandon their runs, engines whining as pilots struggled to regain control. Bombs fell, but not on the village fields. Hedgerows and empty pastures absorbed the deadly payload. Thomas watched, frozen, as the last plane disappeared over the distant ridge. Veering away from the small cluster of cottages and the church spire that had been his constant worry, Margaret ran toward him across the field, her face pale but illuminated with awe and relief. The children followed, laughter and tears mingling as they reached him, clinging to his legs. "You did it," Margaret gasped, voice trembling. "You saved us all." Thomas felt a lump in his throat, a mix of triumph and disbelief. All the hours of tinkering, the ridicule, the sleepless nights, it paid off in the most extraordinary way imaginable. From the village, neighbors began to emerge. Cautious at first, then in growing numbers, eyes wide with wonder as they saw the aftermath. Smoke drifted lazily across the fields, twisted shadows marking the places where bombs had landed harmlessly. Conversations erupted in hushed tones and then grew louder as realization spread. The village had been spared. Thomas's invention, born from eccentricity and relentless determination, had succeeded against the might of the Luftwaffe, yet even in the midst of celebration, a faint tension lingered. A distant engine hummed in the distance, a reminder that war was far from over. Thomas scanned the horizon, scanning for the telltale silhouettes that could bring destruction once more. But for now, the immediate threat had passed. The village had survived, and the odds impossibly, against all logic, had been tipped by a man the world had once dismissed as a fool. Thomas knelt in the field, hands resting on the wooden base of his contraption, and let himself take a deep, shuddering breath. He allowed a small smile to break across his face as he looked at the sky, still streaked with smoke and the faint glimmer of fading light. Today, his ingenuity had made the impossible possible. Today, a farmer's crazy idea had saved lives. And even the most skeptical of neighbors could no longer deny it. And yet, the hum of engines in the distance reminded him that this victory, though monumental, was only temporary. The war would continue, threats would return, and the fragile peace of the countryside could vanish in an instant. Thomas understood that his work was not done, but in this moment he allowed himself to revel in triumph, to feel the extraordinary weight of having turned his knowledge, his courage, and yes, his eccentricity, into something that had truly mattered. The morning after the Luftwaffe retreat, the village seemed to breathe for the first time in weeks. Windows, once shuttered tight against imagined threats, were flung open to let in fresh air. Smoke from chimneys curled lazily toward the pale blue sky, and the golden wheat fields, undisturbed except for a few stray bomb craters, shimmered in the sunlight. Children ran freely along the narrow lanes, laughter echoing across the cobblestones, while neighbors gathered in small groups, trading stories of the night's miraculous events. Thomas Hargrove watched quietly from the edge of his field, hands clasped behind his back, taking in the scene with a sense of cautious wonder. For the first time, the villagers' whispers were not of skepticism or ridicule, but of astonishment and respect. Mr. Ellsworth, the baker, came walking across the lane, hat in hand, eyes wide. "Hargrove," he said, voice still shaking, I don't know how to thank you. You saved us all. I thought the stories were exaggerations, but he paused, searching for words. You did something no one else could. Children peeked out from behind their parents, pointing toward Thomas and murmuring to one another. Finally, seeing the man they had once called mad as something extraordinary, despite the outward accolades, Thomas remained reserved. He nodded politely, a quiet smile touching his lips, but he said little. The weight of what had happened was heavy on him, a mixture of relief, pride, and solemnity. He thought of Margaret, still standing at the doorstep of their cottage, hands pressed to her chest, eyes filled with both fear and pride. He thought of the children, their innocence preserved by nothing more than his stubborn persistence and mechanical ingenuity. And he thought of the village itself, spared from destruction by a device cobbled together in a dusty barn, assembled from scraps, gears, and his unwavering resolve. By mid-morning, A small contingent of RAF personnel arrived, their boots crunching over the gravel as they approached Thomas's farm. One officer, a sharp-eyed man in his mid-30s, adjusted his cap and surveyed the contraption with both professional interest and quiet admiration. "Remarkable," he said, voice low. "We've seen some inventive camouflage and decoys before, but nothing like this. You've demonstrated something extraordinary. We'll need to document it. Perhaps even consider its use in other strategic areas." Thomas listened, nodding, though his focus remained fixed on the simple truth: the village had been saved. Any formal recognition was secondary. The officer gestured to a young pilot beside him, who had been observing the device with wide-eyed fascination. "Do you see how timing, positioning, and visual interference can disrupt targeting?" he asked. The pilot nodded. "This could be scaled up," the officer continued, "but it all started with one man's ingenuity. Incredible." Thomas allowed himself a small chuckle, but it was modest, almost shy. He did not need accolades to understand the importance of what had occurred. The proof was all around him, in the safe homes, the unbroken streets, the laughter of children. Margaret joined him in the workshop, surveying the contraption with both awe and concern. "I still can't believe it worked," she murmured. Thomas put a hand on hers. "I didn't either," he admitted quietly. "But it did. We were lucky, yes, but the plan had to work. And somehow it did." She smiled faintly, leaning against his shoulder, allowing the weight of relief to settle over them both. Outside, the villagers began sharing tales of what they had witnessed from different vantage points. Some had seen the flashes of light bouncing across the sky. Others had smelled the curls of smoke drifting into the village. Every story emphasized the impossibility of the events, the thin line between survival and destruction. Thomas walked among them, offering quiet reassurances, answering questions with clarity and humility. He knew the narrative would grow in the telling, that future generations might call it legend, but he remained grounded in reality. It was careful observation, quick thinking, and countless hours of adjustment that had made the difference, not luck alone. Even as recognition settled over him, Thomas felt a subtle, persistent weight. The danger of war had not vanished. The Luftwaffe would return, as they had elsewhere, and the countryside remained vulnerable. Yet for this brief moment, the village was safe, and that was enough. He understood now, more clearly than ever, the responsibility of knowledge, of preparation, and of ingenuity. To wield it wisely could mean the difference between life and death, between hope and ruin. As evening approached, Thomas returned to the workshop, now tidy in the aftermath, and gazed at his device one final time. The sun glinted off its mirrors, the gears silent, still, but their potential lingered in the air. He thought of the RAF officer's words, of the possibility that this simple invention might influence strategies beyond the village, perhaps even save others in the future. But he did not allow himself to dwell on recognition or glory. Instead, he focused on the quiet satisfaction of having done what needed to be done. The village celebrated quietly into the night. Families gathered around tables and hearths, sharing stories, food, and laughter, a fragile peace reclaimed. And Thomas Hargrove, once dismissed as the crazy tinkerer, walked the fields alone for a moment, looking out over the wheat and hedgerows, the horizon painted in fading amber light. Humble and resolute, he allowed himself a small, private smile. The danger had passed for now, and the lives saved, the gratitude of neighbors, and the knowledge that his invention had worked were a quiet triumph that needed no fanfare. Months had passed since the night Thomas Hargrove's invention turned the tide against the Luftwaffe. Yet the village still carried the memory of that extraordinary dawn. Children played freely among the wheat fields, but their laughter now carried a careful, cautious joy, as though, even in play, they remembered the danger that had once hovered above their heads. Windows remained open, smoke drifted lazily from chimneys, and the village routines, once fragile, tentative, had returned, steadier now, more deliberate. Life had resumed, yet it was impossible to forget what had nearly been lost. Thomas continued his work in the fields, tending crops and repairing farm machinery with the quiet focus of a man who had always known the value of diligence. But the villagers looked at him differently now. Those who had once whispered about the mad tinkerer now paused to nod respectfully. Children following him at a distance, curious about the man who had saved them all, Mr. Ellsworth. The baker often brought him bread with a quiet smile, muttering, "I still can't believe it, Thomas. We owe you everything." Thomas accepted their gratitude with humility, shrugging as though it were nothing extraordinary. In truth, it had been extraordinary an ordinary man, armed only with his ingenuity, had saved lives. The RF officers who had visited weeks earlier returned occasionally, documenting his device and its principles, their reports filed carefully, potentially influencing future defensive strategies across England. Thomas paid little mind to the potential fame or recognition. He cared only that what he had built, what he had risked, had worked. The lives saved, the families preserved were reward enough. Yet, even in this quiet reflection, he understood that courage and quick thinking were sometimes as critical as any army or artillery, that ordinary people could shape events in ways history might scarcely imagine. Evenings were Thomas's favorite time. He would walk to the top of the ridge overlooking his fields, the sunset casting long, golden shadows across the land. Margaret would stand nearby, silently proud, and the children would chase fireflies through the hedgerows. From this vantage point, Thomas could see the skies stretching endlessly above, the clouds shifting in patterns he had studied for years, the horizon calm yet always watchful. The memory of engines, shadows, and flashing lights still lingered. But it no longer brought fear. It reminded him of possibility, of resourcefulness, of the difference one determined mind could make, and there he would stand, quiet and unassuming, hands clasped behind his back, watching the skies for signs of danger that might never come. A humble hero, invisible to history yet unforgettable to those whose lives he had spared. The village thrived beneath his vigilance, a testament to courage, ingenuity, and the extraordinary power of a single individual willing to act when others hesitated. As twilight deepened, Thomas let his eyes wander across the fields, the wheat swaying gently in the evening breeze. Somewhere far above, the distant hum of engines might someday return, but for now all was still, and in that moment he understood the truth that would define his quiet legacy. Heroes are not always celebrated with monuments or medals. They are remembered in lives saved, in communities preserved, and in the unassuming acts of courage that make the impossible possible. The wind rustled through the wheat. Thomas tipped his head skyward, eyes scanning the horizon, calm yet alert. And for the village below, and for those who might one day hear this story, the memory of the farmer's courage would endure. An ordinary man who did something extraordinary, quietly and brilliantly against the odds.